Good afternoon. I'm happy to see so many people here for our next installment, today's installment of the lecture series, Leuven, Colloquia on Ancient Platonism. We, of course, have a very distinguished guest today, Peter Adamson, very well known, also to a broader audience, thanks to his revolutionary podcast, The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, and the books that came from that, but especially the podcast, I would say. So Professor Adamson, for those of you who don't know this, is professor of ancient philosophy, late ancient philosophy and Arabic philosophy at the University of Munich, Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität, Munich. He's a well-known specialist of Arabic and late ancient philosophy. He has written books on Al-Kindi, all kinds of things, many articles. So without further ado, I would give him the floor, but not without announcing, in case you have bad eyesight, the title of his talk, which is Why Platonists Should Do Biology, Parts of Animals 1.5, that's Aristotle, and its late ancient reception. So please, Peter. Okay, so I'm going to do some fun. Maybe it's not.
Now you can hear me. Okay. I mean, you could probably hear me anyway, but now you can really hear me. So this is about a chapter in Aristotle, and it will probably be familiar to a lot of you because it's quite a famous chapter in Aristotle, even though it's found in his zoological treatises, which are kind of famous for not being famous in the sense that nobody actually reads them anymore. And if you are in ancient philosophy, probably the first thing that will come to your mind when you think about Aristotle's zoological works is, oh yeah, Aristotle wrote all this stuff about biology or zoology. People usually say zoology because famously he didn't cover plants, so Theophrastus had to do it, right? And the thing that's kind of famous to us about the zoological works is that it's this weird, extremely extensive part of the Aristotelian corpus that most people who work on philosophy don't think is interesting, except for some exceptional passages. For example, also in Parts of Animals, Book 1, there's a section on hypothetical necessity or teleology that people are very interested in. And then there's this passage in chapter 5, which is sort of becomes proverbial because it's such a striking piece of, I think, what you could even call rhetoric or exhortation from Aristotle, and in that sense is very unusual. What it is an exhortation to do is to study biology, or to even something as concrete as dissect animals. And he tries to make a case for why anyone with an interest in philosophy should think it's worthwhile to do biology. Just as an example of how famous this text is. This is a passage from a Jesuit. I just came across this recently, actually reading up on 16th century for my podcast. So I was reading up on various scientists who went to what they called the New World, right? And this Jesuit scholar named Jose de Costa, who's a natural historian, was explaining why it was interesting to look at the animals and plants that were discovered in the New World. And he says, no matter how low the subject may be, the wise man will derive from it wisdom, and from the basest and smallest of little animals, it is possible to extract the highest reflection and very beneficial philosophy, which I think should be clear once we get into the chapter, is kind of a quick reminiscence of this chapter, and probably back then would have been recognized by anyone as such. So this passage is kind of one that's escaped the orbit of its original context, because even though people don't usually read Parts of Animals very much anymore, it's quite likely that they would have heard of this passage. And I think it's also a passage that was well known in antiquity, maybe even known well to people who weren't engaging very much with the zoological works in general. And that's the impression we're going to get once we start looking at the passage. speaking of the passage, unless you're attending on Zoom, hello, Zoom people, you have a handout. And the handout for the first 3 pages is the whole, or it's not the whole chapter, but the whole part of the chapter I'm going to be talking about. It's not actually clear that chapter 5 was one chunk as opposed to being 2 chunks that were put together. And in fact, the first book of Parts of Animals in general is not, in my opinion, one continuous piece of writing from Aristotle. There are some kind of breaks in it that look like not very successful attempts to jam together bits of text that don't necessarily go together. And insofar as Parts of Animals, book 1 makes sense at all as an introduction to anything, it would probably be an introduction to zoology as a whole, rather than Parts of Animals in particular. But I don't think it even makes sense as a continuous piece of prose by Aristotle. So, and I'm saying this in part to excuse what I'm about to do, which is to read the exhortation as if it were a freestanding piece of philosophical arguments without paying any attention to the context in Parts of Animals, book 1. The main reason I'm doing that is, well, A, to save time, but B, I don't actually think that is necessarily the original context. So it might be literally just a kind of page of Aristotle that someone found, like Andronicus or whoever we think would have been responsible for this, and put it together with some other stray bits to create what we have as Parts of Animals, book 1. And then Parts of Animals proper would start in book 2. That's not really going to make that much of a difference today, but I just want to kind of alert you to the nature of the text we're going to be dealing with. Okay, so in the 5th chapter, we get, as I say, stirring exhortation to study biology or zoology. And the part of it that kind of sticks in the memory is what we just found in our Jesuit visitor to the New World, namely that it's well worthwhile philosophically to study even very lowly animals. Okay, so that's kind of the headline thing that you would remember and take away from it. And I guess that a lot of people assume that what's going on here is that Aristotle's addressing himself to his students, or who are broadly speaking kind of aristocrats, because if they weren't aristocrats, they'd be farming. They wouldn't be there in the classroom with Aristotle. And he's saying to them, look, you're like a very elite group of people. And so you probably don't think that you're the kind of people who would want to do things like going and talking to butchers about the insides of animals, or even cutting up animals yourself, which is something Aristotle famously did. And he's trying to convince them to take this project seriously, and maybe even to get involved in it themselves, okay? So actually, I was just talking to James Lennox about this passage, and this is exactly what he thinks. So he thinks that the point of this exhortation is that it's aimed at a kind of generic aristocratic audience. And he's trying to say, well, you think that political philosophy and ethics is interesting, and maybe you think that metaphysics is interesting. And of course, there's the soul, which is well worth our study. We're going to come back to a passage about that later. But I want to tell you that this apparently squalid thing that you might be the sort of thing you would have a slave do, right? I want to tell you that this is actually worth our attention too. Now, I don't want to rule out that that might be part of the effect of this. And of course, we don't really know who Aristotle's readers / listeners would have been. But what I think, and I'm now going to try to persuade you of, is that there's a much more specific target in mind. And what I mean by target is he's got a much more specific audience in terms of who he's trying to convince to do biology or take biology seriously. And this audience, this is not, I've realized I sort of have done this as if it's very suspenseful who this audience might be, even though the answer has been on a slide now above my head for like 5 minutes. But the target audience is Platonists, okay? In fact, the reason I started working on this is that we were reading the text in Munich in a seminar, and I was just struck by all of the sort of Platonist bells that were ringing for me. Bit of autobiography. I used to work in London, and my colleagues were M.M. McCabe, Verity Hart, Rayful Wolf. So I was the Aristotelian, right? And then without changing my interests at all, I went to Munich and I started working with Christoph Rapp and Oliver Primavesi, and I wound up being a Platonist, right? Because context matters. So whenever we read Aristotle together, I always am the person in the room saying, oh, this reminds me of Plato. And in fact, I think that there's a general tendency in Aristotle to be talking about or to Plato and Plato's students, even in passages where it's not obvious that that's what's going on. So actually, a paper that I wrote quite a while ago is about posterior analytics 219. And that's exactly the point I'm trying to make in that article, is that everything in the chapter can be explained as an allusion to something in Plato. And I think the same thing is true of the exhortation from Parts of Animals 1.5. And I think the most obvious thing that would make you think that this might be true is that Aristotle introduces a kind of competitor for our interest. And the competitor is not ethics or political philosophy or something like that. And nor is it, by the way, something like political action, which would be the competitor in the ethics, right? The competitor is astronomy. And from that, I would immediately infer that he's imagining himself as talking to someone who's already interested in astronomy and needs to be won over to being interested in animals as well. Okay, so that's kind of a first indication that we might be talking to a Platonist here. If you actually just look at the opening lines of the text, and as I say, I've given you the whole text, there's a striking thing about this, which is that he begins by saying, well, there are different kinds of ousiai. Some are eternal, some are not. And already, of course, that's a Platonist distinction, right? So think of the Timaeus, for example. So you have some things that are subject to generation and corruption, some things that aren't. And if you keep reading on, you will notice that, at least on a first reading, it's very natural to think that he's talking about gods, because he doesn't identify at first what the eternal objects are that are contrasted with the objects of the things that are subject to generation and corruption. Of course, we know that in Aristotle, there are eternal ousiai, substances, that are heavenly bodies that are not subject to generation and corruption. But in Plato, or maybe even just in general for a Greek reader, if you say, well, there are two kinds of beings, ousiai, those that are eternal and those that are not, your natural thought would be that the things that are eternal are something like gods or maybe even Platonic forms, right? So in fact, the only reason why we know, or the first hint that we get rather, that he's talking about heavenly bodies is that he says that the eternal ones are only slightly evident to sensation, which means that they're at least somehow accessible to sensation, which means we're not talking about gods, right? We're talking about the heavens. It's also significant that he says that we have a desire to know these things, like a very strong urge to know them. And there I take the we to be significant. So I mean, for one thing, it's a kind of rhetorical ploy, right? He's inviting the listener to share in this motivation with him. But also as I said before, he's presupposing that the audience does in fact share this motivation. So it only makes sense if he's talking to someone who has a strong desire to have knowledge of the heavens, which again, to my mind, makes it more plausible that he's talking to someone like a member of the academy than just a kind of generic aristocrat. So on the one hand, we have this very strong desire to know about the heavenly bodies, these eternal, even divine things, as he's just called them. On the other hand, since we only have this slight access to them through sensation, like they're really far away, all we can do is sort of notice their location from day to day, or night to night rather. We have to make all of these indirect inferences about what's going on up there. By contrast, plants and animals are right here with us, right? Notice, by the way, that he does mention plants, which again is a sign that this isn't designed, this exhortation is not designed as an introduction only to zoology, never mind only to plant parts of animals, which is the work it's been attached to. Rather, it seems to be an exhortation to engage in everything that we call biology, right? So all living things, plants and animals, maybe even including humans. And as you'll see, we're going to come back to that. So this is what he's done here is he's set up already kind of almost like a competition, or if not a competition, then at least a comparison between two sciences, namely on the one hand, astronomy, which he assumes you're already interested in, and on the other hand, biology, which he's worried that you won't be interested in. And then we have this nice long men de sentence. So on the one hand, on the other hand sentence, which goes from page 1 to page 2 on the handout, in which he says that there's a kind of trade-off between the two sciences. So on the one hand, the objects of astronomy are very exalted and noble and even divine, as we've seen, and they're eternal. So that's great. On the other hand, as he's also just said, our access to them is very fleeting. So he says that he compares our access to the heavens to catching a glimpse of a beloved person. You sort of see your loved one go by in the street, and sort of like Dante and Beatrice, right? Obviously, that's not what he has in mind for chronological reasons, but there's this kind of unusually erotic metaphor that we get in Aristotle. I mean, for Aristotle, unusual. So that's the stars. On the other hand, we have the plants and animals, which are quite low ranking in terms of their absolute value, but there's a compensating factor, which is that we have very good access to them epistemologically speaking. So the contrast is really awesome things, really low epistemic access, as opposed to lowly things, really high epistemic access. And the point of the Mende thing is to show that these are in balance, okay? Notice that nobody wins in this competition. So the idea is that in the end, your degree of enthusiasm for biology should be more or less the same as your degree of enthusiasm for astronomy, which of course is quite high, right? Because you're a Platonist. That's the idea. So the idea is not to get you less interested in astronomy. You might have expected Aristotle to do that, right? Because famously, he doesn't like math, right? So he's like, ask the astronomers how many movers we need in the heavens or whatever. He wrote Dicaelo, so it's not like he doesn't care at all, but he wasn't one of these like nerds who was in the Platonic Academy. They sort of imagine that he goes out for a coffee break when they start doing their epicycles or whatever it is they're doing. So, but he's not trying to tell you shouldn't be interested in astronomy. He's just trying to tell you that you should be as interested in biology as you already are in astronomy. Okay, now let's go back to this erotic metaphor. So catching a glimpse of the beloved. The word he uses there, the verb katidein, for catching a glimpse, is one that appears in both Phaedrus and the Symposium for like catching a glimpse of the divine, right? So like the form of the beautiful, for example, in the Symposium. Also, he uses in this passage the phrase divine philosophy, which is a verbal reminiscence of the Phaedrus. And I think he uses the divine philosophy tag after the thing about the fleeting glimpse of the beloved. And I think that you're more likely to catch the allusion if you're already thinking about the Phaedrus, which you would be because you've just been reminded to think about seeing beloved boys, right? Where have we talked about that before? Oh, I know, the Phaedrus. So not only do we have a context in which it's very natural to think that he's talking to Platonists or members of the Academy, but he's also he's deliberately triggering memories of Plato's erotic dialogues, I say. And beyond that, he gives us a whole bunch of other considerations beyond what he's already said for why we should take take biology seriously. And all of these considerations are at least meaningful to a Platonist, and some of them I think would be especially meaningful to a Platonist. So in the first category, we have the fact that, as he emphasizes quite a lot, you can get a lot of pleasure by doing biology, which might seem like kind of strange idea. And in fact, we're going to see much later, historically, and at the end of the talk, we're going to see someone commenting on this passage and dropping this idea because it's kind of implausible that like cutting up shellfish would be pleasant, right? It sounds gross. But Aristotle is actually saying, no, it's not, or maybe it is gross, right? So these are things that are atimia, they're unworthy or inestimable, but actually the pleasure of knowledge that you get out of examining them, that's very intense. And of course, Plato, not famously not a hedonist, right? But also famously someone who thought that knowledge is pleasurable. So think about the pleasures that are associated with the rational soul in the Republic, for example. So the idea of knowledge as pleasant is at least a point of commonality between him and Plato. But I think a more maybe convincing bit of Platonic reminiscence is what he then says, which is that animals are made by a force of nature which is demiurgic. So he uses the verb that goes with demiurge, right? And I mean, maybe we think of the Timaeus more naturally when we hear the word or see the word demiurge than an ancient Greek would, because for them it's actually just a word, right? A demiurgos is a craftsperson. But I still think that this can be read as having a kind of triggering allusion to the Timaeus. So if that's right, then he's sort of segueing from erotic dialogue allusions towards more metaphysical, cosmological contexts with the Timaeus, and then that continues. So the next thing we get is the idea that the enjoyment, the pleasure that we get out of looking at animals, sorry, so it's more complicated than that. He says, you know how you really enjoy looking at pictures of animals, right? Like maybe paintings of animals on temples or something like that. Well, if you enjoy looking at pictures of animals, think how great it is to look at real animals and study them. So again, sounds broadly Platonic, right? So we're moving from images to exemplars. And furthermore, we have the idea that the zoologist is studying causes rather than effects, and form rather than matter. So that all would be consistent with the idea that we're being asked to think about the Timaeus, right? So we've had the demiurge, images and exemplars, and causes and forms, all within a few lines of Greek. You could also think of the Phaedo here, of course. So if that's all plausible, then I think that the last move that he makes is extremely significant, and maybe, to use an appropriate metaphor, the moment where he kind of twists the knife in the Platonists, because the last thing he says is, look, if you don't think that dissecting animals is a worthwhile thing to do because it's kind of gross, then don't forget that you are an animal and you think that it's worthwhile to think about the human body, right? You're just as disgusting as an animal, right? You're made of all these, like a snot, which they call phlegm, but it's just snot, right? Blood, all the sweat, like gross stuff. I won't get into any more details, but yeah, human bodies are just as gross as other bodies, other animal bodies. And yet you don't think that's too gross to take seriously, right? Which actually adds a piece of information in terms of who the intended audience is. This needs to be not just someone who thinks that astronomy is worthwhile. It also needs to be someone who thinks that human anatomy is worthwhile. He's just used the word that goes with demiurgy. Who is it in his immediate context who's got a lot to say about human anatomy? Obviously, it's Plato in the Timaeus, right? So I actually would even say that in this part of the chapter, he's effectively saying to Plato himself, if you think that it was worth having this passage about human anatomy in the Timaeus, then you should also think it's worth doing animal anatomy, right? Because there's no difference. They're both worthwhile because they reveal something about natural causes and form. That's his argument. Now, something that I'm actually not all that wedded to, despite the way I just put this, is the idea that this is extremely polemical against Plato. I mean, fundamentally, it's an exhortation. And it may be that what he's doing I mean, it's certainly dialectical in the sense that he's making certain assumptions about what the audience already values. But it's not clear whether he's, as it were, critiquing them or sort of telling him off for a failure to do something, as opposed to just inviting him, right? Sort of pointing out, oh, since you're interested in these things, you should be interested in biology too, my project. The other thing that's not so clear is whether he's talking to Plato, sort of literally talking to Plato himself, or talking to, more likely, I think, he's talking to some other people who are wedded to Plato's project and are being asked to recognize all these allusions to things we have in the Platonic dialogue. So he could be talking to members of the academy, for example. So I'm kind of agnostic about all that. I'm both agnostic about how hostile it is or how critical it is. And I'm also agnostic about exactly which Platonists he's talking about. But I mean, you can imagine if he's thinking of someone like Speusippus, right? So here's someone who's way too interested in math and way too little interested in biology. Aristotle might be thinking that, and he might be in a way saying, look, if you want to carry on the kind of legacy of Plato, then you should do biology like I am doing, right? Join me in Theophrastus, get your hands dirty. That's the point. Okay, so that's our chapter. That's, or at least the part of the chapter I wanted to talk about. And in a way, I could probably stop there and we could have a 1.5 hour long argument about whether he's talking about Plato here or not. But I thought that would be a little bit thin for a presentation to this august audience. Plus, I'm in Leuven, so I have to talk about late ancient philosophy. So what I'm going to do is now move through a whole sequence of other philosophers who I think are either alluding to our chapter or who are, in fact, obviously responding to it. And the most obvious response will be the last author we look at, because he actually wrote a commentary on the text. Points if you already know who that is. Hint, it's going to be a long wait, historically, to get to this person. And it's not Albert the Great. But first, I want to just point out, because we need this in mind before we get to our first late ancient author, I want to point out that the criteria that are used in Parts of Animals 1.5, namely how worthwhile is the object and how much can we know about it, these are also invoked in another passage in Aristotle himself, and this is from the beginning of De Anima. It's interesting, by the way, that Aristotle thinks that it's a worthwhile thing to do when he's starting out a treatise on a subject. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes he will say, here's why you should be interested in this, right? So in fact, what we do with students too, right? Here's why this is interesting, kids. And he does the same thing in De Anima. And by the way, now we're on to the rest of the handout. So the last 2 pages. So the first bit was just Parts of Animals. Everything else is going to be on the handout. So he says, we take knowledge to be among the fine and estimable things and take one kind of knowledge to be better than another on the grounds either of its precision, I think it's akribeia, yeah, akribeia, or because it is of better or more wondrous things, better and more wondrous things. And by both of these, it's reasonable to put the study of the soul in the first rank. Okay, so this is striking to put next to Parts of Animals 1.5, because as I say, it's the same 2 criteria. So the 2 criteria are how good is the object and how much can we know? And notice that here, the study of soul wins out on both counts. So actually, it looks like if you asked Aristotle, well, which is like the highest priority science in a competition between psychology, astronomy, and biology, he would say psychology. if he's being consistent. I mean, obviously, we can't read too much into these passages of exhortation. He's just trying to get the kids interested, right? But if you take it really literally, what he's saying is psychology beats anything else because, or at least it beats for sure astronomy and biology, because unlike astronomy, we have very good knowledge. We have precise knowledge. And unlike biology, we have very worthwhile targets, namely the soul itself. So whereas in parts of animals, the outcome of the comparison is basically a draw, right? So they're on a par in terms of their desirability, astronomy and biology. In the case of De Anima 1.1, we have science actually being put ahead of other sciences. One thing that we could maybe talk about in the Q&A, if nothing else comes to mind, is what this actually comes down to. So that I've been thinking about this, but I'm not really sure what to say about it. So if you say, well, here's a reason to be interested in this science, like what does that actually mean? So if when he says it's in protois, it's in the first rank, right? So it's among the first things. Does that mean just that you should have the highest level of motivation to study it? Does it mean something more fundamental than that, like its scientific status, perhaps? How it relates to the other sciences? Is it more like a list of priorities, right? So if you only have time to do biology or psychology, you should do psychology. It's not clear to me what, I mean, maybe it could mean all of those things. It's not actually clear to me what this means to say that one science is on a par with another or ahead of another in this respect. But it's certainly striking that he uses the same criteria here as we found in parts of animals. Okay, so now let's move on to our first late ancient authors from the 2nd century CE, who is Ptolemy. And what I want to look at here, you'll be relieved to know, is not the dense, forbiddingly mathematical stuff in the Almagest, or for that matter, the astrology and the Tetrabiblos. I just want to look at the very similar exhortation that we get at the beginning of the Almagest. I feel about the mathematical astronomy sort of the way Aristotle did, I'm afraid. It's like above my head. Not unlike the PowerPoint, which is also above my head. So I think that that Ptolemy is thinking about the material we've just seen in Aristotle when he writes his exhortation to do astronomy at the beginning of the Almagest. And the main reason to think that is that he's going to invoke the same criteria. So how knowable is the subject and how worthwhile is the subject? Of course, he could have gotten that just out of De Anima 1.1, and De Anima is super famous. So you might think, well, we don't really need to invoke parts of animals because he could have just gotten it out of De Anima. And that's not entirely wrong, but I think a reason to think that parts of animals 1.5 might be in the frame is that the thing that was explicitly being compared to biology in parts of animals 1.5 was, of course, astronomy, which is what Ptolemy is now going to be talking about. So when Ptolemy says, well, here's my argument for why we should do astronomy, it's very natural to think that he's responding to Aristotle and saying, well, actually, by your own criteria, astronomy would be the best thing to study. It's not on a par with anything else. It's better than anything else. And in fact, what he's going to compare it with is not biology explicitly, but natural philosophy, which would include biology. Or at least that's part of the comparison. So to do this, he explicitly refers to another passage from Aristotle, which Jan was just telling me he's been interested in recently, which is Epsilon 1, famous passage where Aristotle gives, but I have to say, if I had known Jan's been working on this passage, I would have committed it to memory in Greek before coming here to give this talk. So forgive me if what I'm about to say is imprecise, but it's a kind of famous passage where Aristotle says that there are 3 levels of science or 3 kinds of science, and they are distinguished as follows. So there's natural philosophy or physics, which is the study of things subject to motion. And then on the far side of that is what people usually take to be theology, which is the study of things that are unmoving and not in matter. And in between, we've got this is again almost like a kind of Mend balancing act thing. So in between things that are in matter and in motion, and things that are neither in motion nor in matter, we've got things that are not moving but are in matter, and these are mathematical objects. So we have physics, mathematics, theology. This is an extremely well used text. So you find it all over the place in medieval philosophy, in Arabic and in Latin. Of course, the medievals loved it because it puts theology at the highest rank and so on. Okay, so Ptolemy invokes this in his own text, but then disagrees. Or at least he disagrees with the implication of this, which would put theology at the highest level of desirability. And the reason why he thinks that, or maybe in a way he agrees, because he thinks that it's precisely the middle status of, I think this would be a better way of thinking about it, is precisely the middle status of mathematics that makes it desirable. It's in a way the best compromise you could have between natural philosophy and theology. Why? Well, for the reasons we've already seen. It's going to be about objects, the quality of the object, and the quality of our knowledge of the object. So as far as the quality of the object, he says that we have, this is on your handout too, we have love of the contemplation of the eternal and unchanging, which we constantly strive to increase. Notice, by the way, that he alludes maybe to the contrast between the eternal and the generated and corrupted that we already had in parts of animals. So, and in the respect that it studies something eternal, astronomy has something in common with theology, because theology studies things that are eternal, divine objects, things that can only be grasped intellectually and are completely separate from sensible entities. By contrast, the study of things in the natural world, and here we're going to get a change from what we've had in Aristotle, the study of things in the natural world, for one thing, that's inferior because the objects are inferior, right? So physical objects down here in the sublunary world are not as good as things in the heavens or the gods. But also, here's the disagreement with Aristotle, it's epistemically inferior, natural philosophy. Why? Because these things are subject to flux. They're constantly changing. This could have been suggested to him by the reference to the generability and corruptibility of the sublunary things in Aristotle, or it could just be a kind of standard generic appeal to the flux idea that you get in Plato and so on. But the upshot of it is that, as he says, because of the instability and unclarity of matter, you have to actually put natural philosophy at a lower rank than astronomy. Another disagreement. Aristotle said that when it comes to astronomy, we have this kind of glimpsing kind of knowledge. It's very indirect. We don't know as much as we'd like because we don't have the stars here amongst us the way we have plants and animals amongst us. By contrast, Ptolemy says that we have rock solid, we have bibios knowledge of the things that mathematics studies, right? So he has a much higher rating of the epistemic status of the mathematical sciences. And the upshot is that, as it says here on the handout, the subject matter of mathematics falls, as it were, in the middle between the other two, since firstly, it can be grasped by the mind both with and without the aid of the senses, and second, it's an attribute of all existing things without exception, both mortal and immortal. And then he says about the other kinds of theoretical philosophy, namely natural philosophy and theology, that they should be called guessing rather than knowledgeable grasping. Theology, on account of its thoroughgoing obscurity and elusiveness, that's what Aristotle said about astronomy, right? Natural philosophy because of the instability and unclarity of matter, as I've just quoted here on this slide, so that it's hopeless that philosophers should ever agree about them. Okay, so what we get here is, in a way, I think, a kind of response to Aristotle, where he says, well, I agree about the criteria that you're using to rank sciences, but I disagree about the outcome because, first of all, I rate our epistemic access to natural philosophy lower than you do. Second of all, I rate our epistemic access to the stars higher than you do. And third of all, I've taken advantage of something you yourself said elsewhere, namely that there's these three sciences, natural philosophy, mathematics, and theology. And you've kind of given me an invitation to argue that astronomy is the perfect middle, right? By the way, I've been kind of varying, but going back and forth between saying astronomy and mathematics. So maybe I should clarify that what he actually does is he says it's true of mathematics in general, but the best part of mathematics is astronomy, because astronomy studies these eternal objects, okay? So this is actually, I would submit, very clever on Ptolemy's part. So if you've read De Anima 1.1, in addition to the passage from Epsilon, and even better if you've read Parts of Animals 1.5, you think, he's really like turned the tables on Aristotle here. And furthermore, although we don't usually think of Ptolemy as a Platonist, right? We think of him as an Aristotelian who was a scientist. It's striking that the moves he's making here are quite Platonist, right? So we've got the flux theory of matter. We've got the idea that what we want is to be studying eternal things that can be accessed with mathematical techniques. This is all quite Platonist. And I think that might be in part because Aristotle has, in a way, left a vulnerable flank here, because by appealing to a Platonist, he's given you a kind of Platonist set of criteria for judging whether or not a certain science is worthwhile. And Ptolemy has seized upon this. And in a way, what he's saying is, well, if I were a Platonist, I'd want to study astronomy, I wouldn't be cutting up cuttlefish on the shores of the lake. Do cuttlefish even swim in lake? And it doesn't matter. So I wouldn't be cutting up animals. What I should be doing as someone with Platonist intuitions, as it were, is astronomy, not biology. Okay. Now let's move on to a contemporary, Ptolemy's, who's going to make this kind of Platonist move, but more obviously so. And in fact, the other people we're going to be talking about, their Platonist commitments are more obvious. You'll be glad to know, here in the home of late ancient Platonism. Okay, so a passage, so of course, if we're talking about people who take animal anatomy seriously, then there's someone the only other ancient figure who can compete with Aristotle for that is Galen, right? So literally, someone who did public dissections of animals. But do you all know about the pig, by the way? Quick story. So Galen is trying, this is not relevant, but it's fun. Well, it's fun if you're not the pig. Galen was trying to prove that that Plato and Hippocrates are right and that the Stoics are wrong, that the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, is in the brain and not the heart, right? So in order to prove this, he takes an animal up on a stage. People are watching, and he's such a good anatomist that he was able to expose the nerves and then selectively cut them coming down from the neck, from the brain, selectively cut them to make the animal's limbs go numb, or also to incapacitate the vocal cords. And he says it's very effective to do this with the pig because the pig will be screaming incredibly loudly until you cut the nerves to the vocal cord, and then it will immediately go mute. So he really knew his way around dissecting animals. Famously, of course, he doesn't dissect humans, right? So they did that in Alexandria when they discovered the nervous system, but they're not doing that anymore because of bad mojo when we get to Galen, but he still dissects animals. He's very knowledgeable about animal anatomy. And so you would, in a way, expect him to agree with Aristotle, right? So if anyone's going to agree with Aristotle, yes, biology is important, then Galen. And he does agree with him, but with a significant twist. And the significant twist is that he's going to, as the kids nowadays say, lean into the aspect of Aristotle's exhortation that was about demiurgy. this is and I'm certainly not the first person to suggest that this passage is a kind of reflection on Parts of Animals 1.5. It's a similar exhortation, but at the end of a work instead of the beginning of a work. And if you've gotten to this passage, you're a very patient person because it's at the end of On the Usefulness of the Parts. Notice parts, right? So all the more reason to think it might be responding to Parts of Animals. Very long work. And at the very, very end, Galen gets around to telling you why you would have been reading this the whole time. And the answer is that it's wrong to disdain lowly things because they can tell you so much about philosophy. Well, maybe not philosophy. He doesn't use the word philosophy, I don't think, but they can tell you so much that's worth knowing. Okay. So it's exactly the Parts of Animals 1.5 idea. So not only that, but he even contextualizes the study of animal parts by referring to astronomy or the study of the stars. And he says, who would not straightway consider that some intelligence possessed of marvelous power was walking the earth and penetrating its every part? For you see everywhere that the animals produced all have a marvelous construction, and yet what part of the universe is more ignoble than the earth? That timoteron, that's the same kind of language we've had in Parts of Animals, the stuff about timia, estimability or honorability. Nevertheless, even here there appears to be some intelligence reaching us from the bodies above, and anyone seeing these is at once forced to wonder at the beauty of their substance, first and foremost that of the sun, after the sun that of the moon, and then of the stars. This is almost the reverse of what we had in Aristotle, right? So instead of saying, well, you're so impressed by the stars, but what about the animals? He starts with the animals and he says, yeah, but actually, if you think about it, the stars, that's really awesome, right? By the way, you have the Greek for the whole passage on the handout if you want to see it. So he's comparing the animals to the heavens like Aristotle has done, but as I say, turning it around. And he also makes the point that we can get whatever lessons we're trying to get out of really squalid animals, right? So you might imagine something like worms that you could dissect very easily. In fact, we're going to see worms are exactly what you should be thinking about. And we'll see why in a second. But he says the proofs of nature are to be plain to be seen in all animals, right? Not just humans. And in fact, this is actually a really important point and is made in some ways is in the context of On Usefulness of the Parts, this is a kind of final twist because even though he's just been talking about animals here, the whole book on the usefulness of the parts is really about the human body. So it's about the demiurgic, providential design of nature in constructing the human body. But now he says, you must not suppose that such skill as I've been explaining in this book is displayed in humankind alone. On the contrary, any other animal you may care to dissect will show you as well both the wisdom and skill of the creator, and the smaller the animal, the greater the wonder it will excite, just as when craftsmen carve something on small objects. So his idea here is that, I mean, maybe it's obvious, but his idea is that again, sort of reversing what Aristotle did. Because remember what Aristotle did was, well, you like human anatomy already. So why not think about animal anatomy, right? Actually, Galen almost turns this around by saying, well, in a way, animal anatomy is even more impressive because they're so tiny, yet they're really, really cunningly designed by the demiurge, which is nature. He continues comparing human to animal bodies, and he mentions, funnily enough, Aristotle himself, as well as Plato, Hipparchus, and Archimedes, as examples of really brilliant humans. And then he says, well, there's wonderful intelligence in these human bodies, even though human bodies, as Aristotle mentioned, are kind of gross, right? So anyone looking at the facts with an open mind sees that in such a slime of fleshes and juices, there is yet an indwelling intelligence, and sees to the structure of any animal whatsoever, for they all give evidence of a wise creator, will understand the excellence of the intelligence in the heavens. Okay? So the overall thrust of what he's trying to do here is he's broadly agreeing with Aristotle, right? He's saying just as we should value human anatomy, we should value animal anatomy. In some ways, maybe we should even value animal anatomy more because of this point about the intricacy of the tiny animals. But of course, the upshot is different than in Aristotle. So in Aristotle, the upshot was, well, let's all do biology. In Galen, the upshot is, let us marvel at the work of the demiurge, which is something to which Aristotle only refers very glancingly with a verb, right? So there's craftsmanship involved. He says that, but he doesn't say anything about like a demiurgic power in the heavens descending into matter. But that's what Galen is saying here. This is actually one of the most kind of Timaeus-inspired Platonist metaphysical passages in all of Galen, because of course Galen usually is quite reluctant to make those kinds of moves. He says, I'm just a doctor, I don't know about metaphysics. But here he's really saying, look, everything I've been describing in this book is really all about a divine power, the demiurgic power of nature. Okay, and now let's talk about the worms, or actually his example is the flea, but worms are also relevant. Apparently this is what fleas look like if you really got in close. So sorry to reveal that to you. So he said, so remember he's been saying, well, even like really squalid animals are kind of amazing if you look at them. And then he says, this is also true of animals that are produced incidentally, as it were. So like nature sort of doing it, as they say in German, mit links, right? So like in its spare time, nature churns out all of these fleas and worms and stuff. And even they are really amazing. Never mind what it's doing with humans. So you still have this kind of parity argument between humans and the animals that are more worth mentioning, which I assume includes humans. That's going to be important in just a second. But just to conclude on Galen, I think that one thing that you don't get in Galen anymore is the epistemic point, right? Because remember, a lot of the stuff we saw in Ptolemy and Aristotle was about how much access do you have epistemically, and they disagree about astronomy, but Galen's not actually particularly interested in that. So he doesn't say anything, at least in this passage, he doesn't say anything about how much we are able to get access to animal bodies because we can cut them up or anything like that. He never says anything like that. He's much more interested in the how valuable is the object criterion. In fact, in that sense, it's the reverse of Ptolemy. Ptolemy was mostly interested, I mean, he mentions both criteria, but Ptolemy was mostly interested in the question of how good is our epistemic access. Galen's exclusively interested in the question of how impressive the object is. But as I say, he adds something to make up for what he's taken away, which is this interested in demiurgic providential nature. Okay, now let's think a little bit more about this reference to nature making things kind of incidentally. What does he have in mind there? Well, you might already have suspected, especially since he was talking about fleas, that he could have been thinking about spontaneously generated animals. But you don't have to suspect it because he explicitly says so. So he now says, when in mud and slime, in marshes and in rotting plants and fruits, animals are engendered, which yet bear a marvelous indication of the intelligence constructing them, what must we think of the bodies above? So what he's done here is he's basically said, well, if you think about even spontaneously generated animals, the worst animals that there are, you can see there must have been this demiurgic force creating them, right? So the Platonist implications of what Aristotle's are saying have been laid bare. He's basically taken Aristotle's sort of Platonizing exhortation and inflated it into something that's really Platonist, rather than just a set of Platonist motivations. And he's suggested that you could even use biology to substantiate Platonism, right? Because you need to invoke Platonist metaphysics in order to explain what we're seeing in animal bodies, including spontaneously generated animal bodies. And we're going to get exactly the same thing in Themistius, the rhetorician and commentator who for whom we have some commentaries, for example, so people sometimes call them paraphrase commentaries, and these are sometimes quite Platonist. So, for example, his approach to De Anima sort of is seems to be kind of colored by it's not Proclus, by Plotinus. So all I have to do is come to Leuven and I start saying Proclus. But the passage I have in mind is actually not in an extant preserved Greek commentary. It's in a testimony found in Averroes. So what Averroes is talking about here is a passage in the Metaphysics in Book Lambda, where Aristotle says, well, we don't need to posit Platonic forms because, for example, when a human or a horse is generated, you don't need a form of human or a form of horse. You just need a mommy and a daddy human or horse, right? And in general, what we need as a cause for any effect is something that has the same nature or name as the effect. So for example, fire is hot, it makes things hot, right? So Themistius is responding to that argument in this testimony that we find in Averroes. I think that he might even be thinking of Parts of Animals 1.5, but if not, he's probably thinking of the passage we just looked at in Galen, which, as we're going to see, is very similar to what Themistius is doing. So this may be kind of indirect reference to Parts of Animals 1.5. So what Themistius says is, well, you think that that we don't need a form of giraffe because giraffes come from other giraffes, right? We've already got something with the nature of giraffe to create another giraffe. But you've forgotten that sometimes we get animals without any mother and father, right? They're spontaneously generated creatures. And when you have a spontaneously generated animal, there is no previous animal of the same nature. So where is it coming from? Wouldn't it be natural to think that it's coming from a Platonic form? Or actually, he doesn't say a Platonic form, he says from a soul in nature. So maybe he has in mind something like the world soul from the Timaeus. But basically, you need something Platonist in order to explain the phenomenon of spontaneous generation, which of course is a very clever thing to say to Aristotle, because Aristotle himself believes in spontaneous generation. The thing that most makes me suspect that he's responding to what we've been looking at, apart from the fact that he uses the same point about spontaneous generation we just saw in Galen, is that he explicitly says you shouldn't be deceived into ignoring this phenomenon just because the worms and the flies and the fleas are gross. They're very squalid, yes, but they still tell us something, namely they reveal the activity of the world soul or the demiurge or the forms, or they reveal that we need some kind of Platonist heavy-duty metaphysics. So this is very much like what we just saw in Galen. So if you take the argument of Parts of Animals 1.5 seriously, you wind up not just being a Platonist who's convinced to do biology, you wind up being someone who's been convinced by biology that you should be a Platonist. By the way, whether Themistius thinks this is a knockdown argument is not clear, right? So it might be just, well, here's a kind of dialectical response to you, Aristotle. What about this? It's hard to tell because we only have this little testimony from Averroes, but it looks to me like he's using the idea from Galen. Okay, and finally, your moment to cash in on the prize I offered you, if you knew who the last author is. It's everyone's favorite, Michael of Ephesus. Who is Michael of Ephesus? He's one of the circle of commentators that was gathered around Anna Komnene in 12th century Constantinople. And their project was, maybe this is overly simplistic, but one way of thinking about their project was they were commenting on the works of Aristotle for which they had no late ancient commentary. And that's why they finally get around to writing a commentary on the zoological works, and in particular, Parts of Animals. So in fact, he's the first person to write a Greek commentary on Parts of Animals all this time later. And what he says about it has actually been studied by another scholar named George Aravatsis, who has pointed out that there's this kind of really interesting move that Michael makes in his commentary, which by the way, his commentary in general is like not super interesting. So it's kind of Themistian in the sense that it paraphrases the text. But he does make an interesting move when he gets into this part about the exhortation to do biology, because he imagines the plants and animals speaking to humans. And he says, this is said about balancing things out relative to divine philosophy. That's a quote from Aristotle, which the line that has the allusion to the Phaedrus. As if the animals and the plants were saying to us, O human beings, although the heavenly bodies are estimable and most divine, yet we too have many wondrous features into which you should make inquiry, not wholly disdaining us. So that looks like just a kind of rhetorical flourish, but there are some interesting things that are different about Michael's commentary. Actually, on the second page, on the last page of the handout, I gave you the entirety of his commentary on our passage. So it's pretty short. One thing that's maybe worth noticing about it is that he refers explicitly to the parts of animals. Like if you look in the middle after the ellipses, where I skipped the part where he explains the allusion to Heraclitus, which I haven't said anything about. But notice he says, if someone deems inestimable the theory of parts of which animals consist, that's just interesting because it shows that Michael is thinking of this very much as an introduction to parts of animals and not biology in general or zoology or whatever. But for our purposes, the more interesting thing is that Michael drops out an important theme, which has been running through basically everything we've seen, which is that animals are kind of gross and squalid, right? So he doesn't admit anymore that that's true. So remember what we had in Aristotle was, yes, these things are gross and squalid, but we have such good epistemic access to them, so we should study them. Instead, Michael says nothing about epistemic access. He drops that. I mean, you can read the whole passage. He's not interested in that idea at all. What he says is that it would be wrong to suppose that they are really lowly and squalid. Why? Because they have these extraordinary signs of design in them. So he's now, like an uncharitable reading of this would be that Michael has just completely missed the point. So he's eliminated this lovely kind of Mende structure of the exhortation in Aristotle and replaced it with just the much more straightforward idea, which is that it's childish, a word used by Aristotle himself, to look down on these lowly things. So he's reduced it just to that point. But I think maybe it's not just that he's missed the boat. It might have to do with the context in which he's writing, which of course is a Christian context. So just as these Platonists we looked at before, using the word Platonist in a very broad sense, were saying, well, biology is giving us a sign of the power and providence of higher forces like the world soul or Platonic forms. So I think Michael may be thinking, well, if I've got God designing these things, then I don't want to look down on them. I want to look on them as works of great art, right? So his more simplistic way of treating the exhortation actually fits perfectly with his broader agenda as a Christian thinker. That's pretty speculative, I have to admit, but it's what I could get out of this otherwise not very rewarding passage. Okay, so just to conclude, what we've seen some reflections, I think, on Parts of Animals 1.5, which among other things point towards at least qualifying the widespread idea that I began with, which is that ancient philosophers and philosophers today didn't really care about the zoological works because they cared about this. Actually, there's other reasons to challenge this. For example, James Wilberding has done a lot of work recently on late ancient embryology, showing that they were well engaged with the generation of animals by Aristotle. So these people knew about the zoology. They weren't just ignoring it. Of course, in some sense, they must have known about it because otherwise we wouldn't have it anymore, right? It went through their hands. But it's not just that they were copying it and preserving it. They actually were thinking about it and engaging with it. And I think that what happened in the case of the Parts of Animals 1.5 is that Aristotle, in a way, opened the door to them to think about biology in a Platonist way, precisely because, on my reading, what Parts of Animals 1.5 is doing is saying, well, if you're a Platonist, you should do biology. And then these guys are like, yeah, exactly. But the reason we do biology is that biology gives us some kind of hint towards transcendent causes, the kind of causes that we accept and that you broadly reject, Aristotle. And that might shed some light on a passage that some of you probably know quite well, which is kind of weird passage in which Proclus wants us to believe that Plato is better at natural philosophy than Aristotle is. So he says, part of natural philosophy extends to the study of animals, something which Plato has given a detailed explanation of with regard to all their causes, including the final causes and supplementary requirements, while in Aristotle's work they have only with difficulty in a few cases been studied in relation to form. For in most cases, he stops at the point of matter, and by pinning his explanations of physical things on this, he demonstrates to us just how far he falls short of the teaching of his master. And I think any modern reader reads that and was like, dude, what? The guy literally wrote like a shelf full of zoological works, and all we've got from Plato is the Timaeus, and even that is mostly not about what you're talking about. But I think what Proclus is saying here makes sense if you think his point is that biology has a very special significance, and the point is not to get mired down literally in the stuff and the cutting up of the fish and so on. That's Aristotle being small-minded. What you should do is use biology to inspire you to appreciate the demiurge, the gods, the world soul, the forms. And in that sense, he's accepted an invitation from Aristotle that Aristotle was probably not intending to issue. Okay, thanks very much.